Right, so welcome again, everyone, to our weekly call. What I thought we would do today, I see John Todd is on. If John wishes to, we conversed over email, but I don't think we'd actually got to reply.
I just sent you a reply which
it.
said I've got. That's okay. I can talk a little bit about some things just anecdotally. I'm sorry I don't have any numbers or graphs to give you.
Okay, well, let me hastily set expectations for this first. In that case, so given the discussion we had last week with Joe Crow from Comcast, who talked a little about some of the experiences to date and some of the observations from the sort of DOE resolver that Comcast had fired up, I thought it might be useful to see from sort of John's perspective as a non-ISP resolver in the case of Quad9, what if any experiences he could share. But as you've all just heard, we've only literally just this second caught up, so John will give his anecdotal experiences.
Sure. The anecdotal experiences on encryption are kind of as we've seen really for the last year or more now, that DOT is still our primary encrypted protocol. Quad9 is not still not in the Mozilla TRR program. So people selecting DOH for Quad9 are doing it manually, or they're using example files and other software. Obviously, the browsers are driving a large portion of the market, so it's not as significant. DOT, though, we do see it's about, I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers, but I'm going to guess it's about 5-to-1 still, where we're seeing DOT versus DOH traffic. That's being driven primarily because of forwarding caches starting to support DOT, so unbound being the primary one. People point quite a few of their forwarding caches to Quad9, so we see a significant portion of that now becoming encrypted. DOH, of course, is still growing faster than our customer base is growing, so there are people adding it on. But I think the lesson here is that, as everybody sort of knows, from an individual user perspective, they'll use whatever the defaults are of their browser. Very few people will go in and configure things manually, and really the conversion to encryption is driven significantly at the end user perspective by whatever the defaults are in the browser. So no surprises there. But I am heartened by the number of sites that are using DOT built into their forwarding cache. That's actually been very encouraging to see. That's a lot of European traffic, not as much North American, and not as much Asia Pacific or Africa. So we are seeing the bulk of that coming into our European locations. Again, privacy being to some degree much more in the forefront of people's considerations there. Although, again, I'm surprised actually we don't see more in Asia, where filtering is or DNS interception is more prevalent. So I think that's just that there's a longer, potentially unsubstantiated, but there's potentially a longer cycle for getting the newer software into potentially Asian locations. I don't know. That'd be an interesting study to see why the lag and the uptake, what the delta is. But that's in a nutshell our summary. It's still in the single digits percentage of our overall traffic volume encryption in total, but it'll cross over into double digits soon, I think. Meaning in the next 2 quarters or so would be my guess. And of course, that all changes if we are ultimately added to the Mozilla TRR.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, John. I mean, one thing it does confirm, as you said, is that most users are driven by the defaults and not doing the manual config, which I guess we all sort of assume. But yeah, that seems to be showing up in your traffic stats as well, which is always helpful to know. So does that prompt any questions from anyone or any comments, other thoughts you wish to come in on and share? And remember to unmute before you do that. Zaid.
Yep, maybe just a sentence or two on operational challenges.
operational challenges have been mostly focused around new code base. So we're deploying both DOT and DOH in the DNS dist stack from PowerDNS. And so any of the problems we've encountered have primarily been discovering, minor nits and flaws in both our configuration of that and, allocation of resources, number of sockets, et cetera, and potentially some code changes that needed to be made to give us some more flexibility. We haven't really seen operational effects that are customer driven, other than basically any amount of traffic would have shown some of these issues. So it's not a volume based question yet. So how we handle that in the future and operational lessons, looking at TCP load and how do we diverge our DOH or DOT traffic onto other platforms, or how do we manage that? We're still coming up with methods to give us, I think, some better metrics on how to do that. So I don't have any clearly translatable operational experiences that would work for anybody else, other than to say, it just kind of works. The volumes are not so big these days that it is an insurmountable load. So I would say, by all means, try it and see what the numbers look like at a small level. You're not going to see an overwhelming volume. This is going to be an opportunity that's lost in a year or two or three, when most traffic is encrypted, and turning it on at all is going to be, it's going to be a crisis, or it's going to work. Like right now is the time to start experimenting with DOH in your networks. And so I would say do it now while the opportunity's there.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point on switching it on now, whilst it's not going to just fall over straight away because of the volume hit. So thanks, Zaid. Anyone else got any questions for John or observations sort of based on what he said?
Yeah, hey, Glenn here. I had my hand raised, dude. Trying to follow the rules.
Apologies, sorry, I didn't see that. I will scroll up. I can see it now. Sorry.
So yeah, so Glenn here. One of the questions I was sort of mulling even before this chat with John was, maybe we need some new statistics that we start trying to gather. Because when Joe was talking last week about transactions, and this is all big numbers to very small numbers. It's hard to apples and oranges that have gone bad versus new oranges we just got in from the store. I mean, it's very confusing. Maybe what we need is to consider gathering something more simple, such as the ratio of DOH to DO53, DOT to DO53, and then DO to dot, and then even to combine DO and dot to 53. So we get a very simple statistic that says, here's how much traffic as a ratio is being encrypted overall in the net. Here's the breakdown of the two protocols that do that, that encryption. And here's the amount of that, the ratio that's not encrypted on the net. And that might yield numbers we can compare across different platforms in a more easy to understand way. And it doesn't require anybody to reveal their operational transaction numbers or any other fancy detail. So it's a very simple ratio.
Reasonable. I mean, we do collect that, actually that exact set of statistics currently. It's interesting in that sometimes it fluctuates significantly. Again, in our case, because of what I would probably describe as a very different model for most of our queries than most of you on the call would see, except for the folks at Google, Cloudflare, and OpenDNS and other centralized resolvers, in that we have in fact, I would say the vast majority of our query volume is coming from forwarding caches. We have, of course, millions of end users, but we really try to encourage people to use their existing infrastructure. So it's ISPs and things like that converting over. So a lot of the data from us is sometimes hard to interpret. If we get a new forwarding cache architecture pointing at us that's got 3 or 4 million people, suddenly the numbers just completely go out of whack, and then they'll stay there for a week, and then they'll unknown to us, because sometimes we don't even know necessarily, well, we know who they are from a network perspective, but we don't know who they are from an organizational perspective. They'll switch over, or that traffic will go in half as they split across multiple resolvers. So it's a weird number set, let me put it that way, from us. But it is, of course, steadily growing. If you zoom out far enough, it's clearly on a very marked incline. So yes, interesting. It's something that we would probably be happy to put together, but there need to be a lot of caveats on, like, how do we understand what this actually means? And there are some days where it's a drop, from last week. Like, over what period of time are you measuring growth? Those kind of things. And so we would be probably okay with that. You might have some resistance from the commercial providers who are less interested in that. Actually, that might not be true. I think everyone is interested in seeing encryption stats. So maybe this would be a widely adopted statistic. So I think that's a good idea, Glenn.
Okay. Any other resolver operators? I can see Glenn's got his raised hand before he comes back in again. Well, unless it's relevant to that. So resolver operators with ISPs or standalone that wish to sort of comment on whether you'd be happy to share. I think I noted 4 stats, if I got them right, Glenn, which were DO53 to DO volumes and DO53 to dot volumes and to encryption overall volumes, and then ratio of DO and dot to each other.
Well, specifically, so when you say volumes, always avoid. So it would be always a ratio of volumes.
Sorry,
It
ratios.
never be absolute volumes. So it's just the whole goal here. And John makes some really good points. And like any statistic, you have to understand what the statistic is collecting, not just a number, right? And clearly, different environments, these numbers might mean slightly different things. Like if I were to, for instance, do it on Mozilla browser, I'm guessing the ratio of encrypted to non-encrypted in North America is pretty high because
you would think
they've turned it on all across the US,
yeah.
But there's still those pesky Canadians. So North America still has some outliers, and technically Mexico too, because we're all part of North America. But it starts giving us an understanding, and then I look to somebody like Jeff Houston to take these magic numbers and sort of give us an overall sense of on the network itself, what is the ratio? Because that's even going to be hard for anybody that is even if you're an ISP, that would be very hard because DOE is bundled in with your HTTP traffic. And unless you're doing stuff you shouldn't be doing, right? Or that people have said that, then who knows? But, just in terms of pure transactions and ratio of transactions, it might allow us to get a new meaningless number that we can argue about.
Which is always a good thing, Glenn.
Keeps us employed.
Indeed. Okay, well, I'll put something in the notes to that effect, and then maybe people can come back afterwards and indicate if you'd be happy to compile and share those ratios as opposed to absolute numbers. See what we think. I guess if
and let me be clear. So, Andrew, let me be clear. So this isn't I've not cleared this with other parts of Comcast. This is me as a leader in the community putting this idea out of, is this a useful number that we should discuss? And if so, let's discuss it in and out and where it's going. And then maybe we start, bringing some people together through Eddie or through your calls or through other places and collect those things and say, is this a useful number? It may be, when we look at it and we, chew through it, a totally useless number. But it may turn out to be something useful.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can have a further discussion in a couple of weeks' time, perhaps, and once people have had a chance to sort of sleep on it, see if there's a broad comfort in gathering the data, and separately in if people have got any thoughts as to the usefulness of actually having those numbers. See what they think. Okay. I think Brian had his hand raised next. So do you want to come in, Brian?
Yeah, it's a question for John.
You're a little faint, Brian. You might want to lean closer to the microphone.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what's going on with my computer these days. I'm curious as to the performance impact of the encryption in the real world. Like, do you need, assuming everyone turned on encryption, do you need more servers to serve the same amount of traffic? Have you got any sort of stats along those lines, things like that? Any thoughts?
I sort of alluded to that. Yes, there is more resource required. The resources required, though, there's two different flavors of that. The first is, what do you need under normal operational conditions? And then the second is, what do you need under denial of service conditions? And the operational numbers seem to be that there is an additional load, but it is not unreasonable. And what those numbers are, I don't have. And I kind of alluded to the fact that we have to actually come up with that. We were trying to formalize those ratios internally ourselves and come up with a number. So it doesn't seem to be overwhelming, though. It doesn't seem like we need, double the machines or triple. Clearly, it's a percentage, and it's probably a reasonably small percentage. At least reasonable as far as normal growth on the internet goes. The trick is what happens under denial of service conditions, and what kind of denial of service conditions is really where the interesting things happen. And that actually might require significantly more resources, or there might be some clever ways to reduce it so that it's not an overwhelming load. So I would say jury's still out on both of those things. We haven't to do any forklift upgrades yet on our infrastructure to support the DOE loads at all. We're planning on adding additional machines in certain hotspots, especially in Europe, but that's mostly as a precaution and not necessarily based on the final numbers yet, because we don't have them. So yes, there is some. It is not overwhelming, would be my short form, until I've got a better answer that's based on more numbers.
Great. Thanks, Brian, for the question. I think, Glenn, your hand was up next, unless it was a carryover from last time.
It was not up, Andrew. My virtual hand seems to have a mind of its own.
Okay, easily done.
Dr. Strangelove.
In which case,
that's a great movie.
We'll segue seamlessly to Ralph instead. Then, no connection with the Dr. Strangelove comment.
No. There was an interesting talk at DNS ORC from Peter Spacek from the NOT guys, and he sort of said that there's a kind of a 3 to 5x of kind of resources you need when handling the same amount of clients that you handle from UDP. That was based on throughput numbers. On my non-scientific testing, most of the additional load seems to go to sort of user CPU time. Now, previously DNS with UDP was very much the network card and the interrupts and getting packets from network cards to the server was the bottleneck. With DOE and other encryption, the CPU or the CPU ability to encrypt and decrypt stuff becomes more of a bottleneck. So it shifts from where the bottleneck is, I guess.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting observation.
I don't think we've seen the 3 to 5x number. That could be just in practice. We don't see that for the load that we have. It might look that way in testing. So as I said, I came to this call without necessarily having prepared the full numbers, but 3 to 5x seems anecdotally seems high. It might be double, but again, we could be surprised with the way that this looks with millions of end users. So I don't think we have millions of end users now doing encryption.
Yeah, I think what Peter said, you have to run your own sort of numbers. And my understanding from your load is that you mostly have forwarders, which means that the initial high CPU intensive ASIC public-private key cryptography happens once, and then the connection stays open. Whereas if you have end users that are browsing, you have much more connections that are open and closed. And I think that may be the reason why the numbers that he had and that you have is different, because it's a different data set.
Could be.
Okay. Any other questions for John? Right. Given silence plus no raised virtual hands, I think we've probably done that. That was, well, despite the lack of any sort of meaningful preparation time, John, I think that was a useful discussion. So thank you.
Welcome.
For that, and we'll maybe do the same in following weeks if others wish to step forward as well. But we will explore separately the idea of sharing some ratios as well. So yeah.
And just also to update some of my numbers, and I had initially said 3 to 5x for DOT to DOH, and I'm wrong. It's been a couple of weeks. Actually, it might have been more than that since I've looked at that ratio graph. We're actually now down to probably about 1.8 to 1 DOT to DOH. So DOH has been catching up fairly quickly.
Well, that's quite a material change in a fairly short space of time.
Well, there was, there've been a number of things that have come online for that, but yes, it's a significant change. DOH is clearly ramping much faster than DOT as far as number of users. DOT queries, though, are still winning because, again, those recursive forwarding caches are producing lots and lots of traffic.
Well, there you are, live updates. That's most impressive. Thank you. Okay, I've got a few things to just bring up on the call, but before I do that, is there anything that anyone else would like to bring up first? Give you a chance to think.
Hi, I have a question about Apple's recent changes around iOS 14, their introduction of DO on that. Really, I was trying to understand more about the how the devices are configured and the use of resource record type 65, and if anybody has sort of traced all of that. I've found limited information online, so I'm trying to mock that up with a DOH server and set some things up to, let's say, work out what's happening there. But if anybody's done similar work, I'd be interested in sharing info there. The most immediate thing I could think of is, I think on one of Tommy Pauly's presentations, it mentioned an XML file to configure iOS.
Yeah, I've done
not been able to find anything about that so far.
I've done an XML file for myself, just to play around. And if I can find it, I have it, which I shall.
Okay, Alistair, should I do this through the EDDI email list and perhaps make some questions on that?
You could do. I haven't. I've seen that it's doing the magic record lookups, but I haven't got a DNS master that I can fake up the response, because I'm going to have to hack. I might have to hack my Do server to lie slightly, because because the patches for it are just not they're sitting in people's GitHubs.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll take it up on the list then. I think that's probably the best things. But thanks.
And before Ralph comes in, I was going to mention, so it's a useful opportunity to mention it. If you haven't seen it on the sort of the news this week, NextDNS has put out a custom config file for iOS 14, so you can enable NextDNS on Do on iOS 14 devices without downloading the NextDNS app. So that's the first custom config file reference that I've seen from any of the DNS operators.
I think I found Quad1. I haven't looked for it again. I could look again, but I swear I saw something for Quad1.
Quad1 or the Cloudflare, did you mean?
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm sure I saw one for them.
Yeah. Okay.
But it was one of those I should have kept the URL moments.
if you find it, feel free to share it.
Thanks, Alistair.
Ralph, sorry, you wanted to come in on that, I think.
Yes. So first of all, these kind of XML files are provisioning profiles.
Yeah.
So they sort of define what your device goes, and downloading one from the internet and just installing it seems to be an absurd bad idea for me, because these are the stuff that gives you kind of very much power over what the device does. I mean, granted, I guess they only have the DNS effect, but the provisioning profile format and what you can do with it is kind of like, that's
powerful.
what IT normally uses to lock down your device, and so there is a risk in that. I mean, it is also possible to use an app. I think I did that, and I did some research on the HTTPS record, so type 65, and this really is in use most, and has nothing to do with DOE, because it mostly is there to solve the DNS CNAME at the apex problem. So rather than asking for A and quad A, you ask for an HTTPS record, and that can give you a redirection where you want to go, or that can tell you want to connect with H2 or you want to connect with Quick to this server. So this is more of the things. There is an additional draft that defines a parameter within the HTTPS or SVCP spec that gives a DOE URI for the domain. That's a draft. I have enough authoritative servers I mock up, and I mocked that up and tried to fold it to go to my DOE server, and it didn't. So while the draft is there, Apple hasn't implemented it, at least. They're just having the basic HTTPS SVCP spec.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I can see as we've been talking, Ron, thank you. You've posted in the chat a link to the Cloudflare blog post.
Yeah, we've actually been tracking that quite closely here in Canada, and the queries per second on our Power DNS environment went from like 5,000 to over 35,000 queries per second,
right,
in a matter of days since the launch of iOS 14.
Okay, which, yeah, is no great surprise if I guess Cloudflare in particular having a strong presence, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess note to others then to put out, if you've got DOE resolvers, maybe sort of put out something similar to make it easy for people to do the settings if you're able. Okay, thank you for sharing that, Ron, and thank you, Jim, for the question. That was a great question. The other, I thought it would be only reasonable, in fact it follows on very nicely from that, since we're sort of indirectly talking about discovery of resolvers. In case you hadn't noticed, I see that our esteemed co-chairs of the ADD working group have requested a second session at IETF 109, a 1 hour slot to accompany the existing 2 hour slot that's already been requested for the ADD working group, following the poll, the doodle poll of a week ago, asking people for their views on whether that will be useful or not. So there potentially should be a good slug of time at IETF 109 next month to cover all the current issues that we need to around discovery, which is going to be increasingly important. The other thing, talking about the working group, and we'll be interested to see if anyone comments on this, as an observation, after an initial flurry of input to the user requirements document that Chris Box put up on GitHub, dare I say it, the sort of traffic has quietened down a bit. Hopefully, because that's people are thinking about it a bit more deeply in terms of their inputs. But I guess we probably all need collectively to try a bit harder to provide more input to sort of help move that document forward. Without putting, well, let me put Chris on the spot. Chris, is that a fair comment from your point of view as the sort of author stroke editor of the document? If you're still on, we should cut you on.
Well, what I'm struggling with is where to focus the draft, because we had one view from the end of the first interim, but there are other people in the working group who want to work on areas that are outside that. So it's Glenn, did you want to talk on that point?
Nice job of having the spot put on you, and then taking that golf ball, putting it down, taking out your driver, and knocking it over to my green. Well played, sir.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Chris. No, please go ahead. Go ahead, then I'll jump in, Chris.
Well, yeah. So, I've got a choice. I can either, issue a new draft that is focused purely on the area that kind of Martin Thompson outlined as his single use case, which is the simple one where you're joining a network. It's a new network. You don't have any prior configuration or knowledge about it, and you just want to discover the encrypted resolver. And you can use that in a number of places, including in ISPs. But there's it depends on what else pops up on the list in terms of whether there are going to be similar drafts at the same time, or whether we are just going to focus on that. I mean, my co-authors have got particular views. I mean, so some of them are happy to proceed with that, and the others, they're hedging their bets. So, obviously something will need to be floated on the list this week. It's just a question of what.
Yeah, so let me jump in and add a few comments here. There's a couple of things. One is the group doesn't necessarily need to be focused. And again, I'll preface this with everything done in the ADD group is driven by the group itself and what the group wants to work on. So it isn't, the chairs will say, you will do the following. We want you to turn out 3,000 lines of code a day for the next 6 weeks, and then we're going to call it a day. That's not how it works. we guide, we nudge, we observe, we nudge. So let me make some observations and some nudges. One is people seem to be approaching the problem as a discussion of, well, we can do this or we can do that, but we can't do both. There must be one approach that solves it for everybody in all situations. Maybe, and I don't know the answer to this, but maybe there is, a need for two approaches. Maybe there are different environments in which one approach works really, really well and satisfies all the needs for that environment. And maybe for other environments, you need a different approach, maybe completely different or a modified version of the first approach. And getting locked into we need one that works for everybody and it has to look exactly the same may not be the best path forward. It may be that we get there in the end, but maybe the path forward in the near term is to have people focus on the questions that are important to them. And this gets back to it's what the group does and what the group produces that matters. So let's say that there is one group in the ADD that is very interested in working on developing drafts around one scenario. Okay, go for it. That's how the IETF works. You write drafts, you produce drafts, you submit them, and you get them discussed and reviewed. And if they bubble up big enough and with enough support, and the working group wants to adopt them, then they become adopted and they move forward as a working group document. But let's say there's a second group that says, well, that is a good use case, but maybe it's too simple, and it doesn't cover a lot of the other difficulties that we are having to in our operational environments also deal with. Okay, that second group isn't precluded by the first group wanting to work on one particular aspect from also writing their own drafts and submitting them to the group for discussion. And I find that the situation we are in ADD is a little bit different sometimes than maybe other working groups are in. So, we are providing a discovery mechanism. We're not telling you which one to pick, which one to choose. We're not saying there can only be one. We're saying a discovery mechanism to be used by, systems that are trying to discover DNS resolvers. There's a lot of different kinds of systems out there. There is mobile phones, there is browsers, there's applications, there's operating systems, there's operating systems and devices that are designed to operate in very secure environments that are highly managed. There's applications and operating systems and devices that are designed to operate in very loosely managed things, or in the hands of end consumers where they largely just take a lot of defaults handed to them by whatever they're using. These are different worlds. They're connected, they're all in the internet and they all want to use DNS, but they're different environments. And so as we're looking through these things, maybe maybe we need to have people, instead of trying to get one answer, maybe it's two, maybe it's three. I don't know. I just want to put that out there as a thought for people to consider. I'm going to try to put out to the lists this week. I've been chewing on how I want to make a diagram that sort of shows that we're working on a spectrum of environments. On one end, we have a very, very open, loose environment, and that would characterize what a lot of people think is, well, that's all I need. I just need I'm on the open internet. I don't have any things in between me and it. I don't have any local policies I need to comply with. I'm just open, and I want to talk to a server, and I just give me my data. And then we have other people who range from more restrictive environments to very restrictive environments. And while the IETF can't solve problems for everything, because we end up producing standards which are thousands of pages, and they would get into some very fine detailed edge cases, there may be enough room in those two spectrums, those range of spectrums, that we might need to, at least for the time being, approaches documented and developed while paying attention to each other and how you're doing it. So I'm going to try to put out some nudging email on the list to get people to think around those terms and see where that goes. I will point out that the deadline for drafts for IETF 109 is, let's see here, it looks like it is October 2nd. Sorry, November 2nd.
You
people are hard to
No, sorry. It's these dates that are like 11/2 and 2/11, and so November 2nd. Wow, that's going to be a great. So November 2nd, then the election is November 3rd here in the U.S. That's going to be that's going to be a busy week, filled with a lot of stress and anxiety on many fronts. So okay, November 2nd. So that roughly gives us a little less than a month, a little less than 4 weeks worth of writing to produce drafts. And I will, and I'll give the microphone back to everybody in a minute. I'd like to encourage you, if you did not attend the working group sessions for ADD, please go listen to or look at the notes from the interim sessions, the 2 interims that were held a couple weeks ago. There were some really good discussions there. In particular, the second session where we talked about authentication and the topic of can DHCP play a role here very much came up and was very, very well discussed by the group. And so I would encourage people to please go back and read those notes, because I think they form a direction that the group is sort of becoming comfortable with, and something that this is the time to look at them and weigh in on those topics of how you feel about these particular positions that were developed on the call. So, and that I will yield, Mr. Camplin.
Fantastic, thanks, Glenn. I think there's a good steer to us all. And yes, after the near heart attack of it was last Friday as a deadline. There's a whole month to get submissions in, which is a timely reminder. So thank you. Right, Jim's had his hand up for a while, and Simon has also raised his hand via the chat. So Jim first, then Simon.
Thanks, Andrew. I just want to expand on a couple of points that Greg has made and actually go back to what the issue Chris originally raised. I think we want to be very, very careful here that we don't try to come up with a single overarching solution that solves us every single possible scenario that might potentially arise. That's another attempt at boiling the ocean, and it's just never ever going to complete any time within the side of the next ice age. So I think we tried to try and focus this little work, and in my opinion, Chris, there was a fairly strong steer that you got from the interim meetings that a solution based around DHCP, possibly even the Slack as well for those IPv6 fans, is probably the way to go for now. That could be an initial use case and a solution for that problem space. Now, maybe we might need to look at some other use cases and things later on, but that doesn't mean to say we have to do one approach and not do the other inside the working group. Glenn was making that point just a moment or two ago. So I think what we need to do is get something done fairly quickly that solves the immediate case for either the simplest or the most commonly used scenario imaginable, and that's like a DHCP or a Slack-based approach. We might need to look at other things, say, for example, in captive portal scenarios, or perhaps for idiot IoT devices and CPE type devices. But I think those things should come possibly later and or in parallel with the work that's going on with a DHCP based solution or focused solution. And I think we should try to keep that initial emphasis there. If we try to go off in several different directions, the result is, as Glenn pointed out, is we'll end up with a huge RFC that's thousands of pages long, maybe in 10 years' time. And by that point, it's completely irrelevant because everybody's out there doing dots widely deployed and used, and whatever the vendors are actually using to do discovery will be the de facto standard because they'll have their own implementation scenarios.
Yeah.
So we've really got to get off our backsides and come up with something which works fairly quickly and solves the immediate problems for the most common use cases or the most likely use cases, rather than trying to think about how can we fix problem A, problem B, problem C, blah, 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 and end up getting nowhere. And with that, I'll shut up.
Thanks, Jim. So I guess there's a strong hint as to which bits of the user requirements doc need to be filled in first, I think, from that, which is helpful. Okay, Simon, you raised your hand as well. Do you want to come in?
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, agreeing to Jim's points there. I would just say we have a sort of an issue from a governmental perspective, which we probably share with a lot of other governments, so, you know, sort of how it's structured, and that structure is open enough that it can be configured so that most of the infrastructure and the access points can sit within a national country. I guess the IETF is not actually wedded to being able to provide that as a solution, because of course we're not looking at the solution here, we're looking at a range of solutions. But it would be useful from a governmental perspective if that was amongst the range, which I think essentially it is and will be, but not, of course, if most or all solutions lock that option out. Thanks.
So could I ask you to clarify that? So when you say it should be structured such you can do that, what are you referring to?
The way in which DOE operates.
So the solution, the discovery protocol solution.
Yeah. So that there is a resolver solution where the resolver is physically present within a national territory.
Okay. Thanks.
And just as a side observation, as I come to Glenn and then Jim in a moment, I know the EU is also now talking about digital sovereignty rather more seriously, which I guess is, we could argue that what Simon discovered is kind of a part of that potential.
That's the political title for it, yes.
Yes, indeed. The issue of the day. Glenn, did you want to come back in either on that or Jim's comments?
I did want to come back in on what I perceive as maybe a slight misunderstanding of the role of the requirements document. So the requirements document isn't necessarily the blueprint for what the working group would produce, right? It isn't like a commitment of we will satisfy all of these requirements in all these different scenarios. It's gathering an understanding of what the requirements are in those different scenarios, so as to evaluate whatever other solutions are proposed by the members of the working group. So, for instance, that means that a requirements document can in fact have requirements in, which are then marked as this is a nice to have, but we are not going to address that at this point in time, and we're going to leave it for the future. And that's perfectly acceptable. And I think some people misunderstood, a little bit, the role of requirements documents. They're not a commitment to deliver a result that will tick every last box in that document. They're a discussion of what those requirements would be in different environments to allow the group itself to understand them and evaluate which ones are the priorities to address, because you never ever can address every requirement ever.
Yeah, unless we get into the 10 years and the 1,000 pages RFC that was mentioned earlier, which we don't want to do. Okay, thank you, Glenn. Jim, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, just to what Glenn was saying, first of all, yeah, I understand that we want to try and be reasonably comprehensive in terms of gathering requirements, but there will come a point where we have to sort of draw a line and say, enough. we've either got as many use cases and requirements as we conceivably imagine, and we're not going to go beyond that point within the working group. At some point, someone's going to have to draw a line and say, we've got to go on and try and do some more work rather than keep on trying to enumerate more use cases and requirements. That has to come to a stop at some point. And yes, you're right. It doesn't mean to say that those other requirements can't be addressed later if and when the need arises. But one concern I have in an IETF setting is that if we then go beyond that use case requirements document and start working on solutions, I'm a bit concerned that some people perhaps further up the food chain in the IETF might then come back and say to the working group, you've got a reasonably baked RFC for a discovery solution, but you've not addressed this requirement that was in your requirements document. Go back and start again, or have another think about it. And at that point, this is where I think you and Dave are going to get the big bucks, Glenn, because I think you're going to have to stand up to the area directors and say, this is what the working groups felt is the right approach, and we now have to take a pragmatic solution of how to actually ship something which solves an immediate problem. So I'll just leave that out there as something. But I also want to pick up on something that Simon said about the countrywide requirements. To my mind, from a technical point of view, that doesn't seem to be all that different from the sort of requirements you would have inside an enterprise network. I mean, fundamentally, we're talking about the same thing, albeit in a different scale, a slightly different context, but it's really about the scenario as a device joins the network and it gets to the resolver networks, it gets to the resolvers which are required to be used for local policy reasons on that network. Now, that could be a network which is an enterprise network, or it could be a public network for an eyeball, for big ISP, in which case the ISPs providing resolver services that comply with prevailing national law and regulation. So I'm not sure there's a great distinction to be made there. Maybe there's some aspects from a policy consideration which are different, but from a technical level, that sounds to be the same thing to me.
So can I respond here? Just a couple of points, Jim. Number one, you're right. There is always a point where you have to cut off the discussion of what the meta discussion is. Absolutely. Two, I am totally prepared, and as I believe my co-chair would be, to send a sternly worded memo upwards in the chain. We're not shy, if necessary. But also reflect back that, again, the way these things work are very much bottom up. And so it is what the group wants to work on and produce, and not what is sort of told from above that you must do in a particular way. So there's a balance, and we'll work through it. I still remain confident that we'll get there, and we'll get there in good time. So, and I will also point out to anybody listening to this thing that maybe doesn't understand the IETF process, because some of this discussion is slipping a little bit into the policy space of, the choice of the resolver and in territory. Interesting discussion, but will be out of scope of the ADD working group, because we're not chartered to discuss policy or even the selection logic that a client would use. We are chartered exclusively to be a mechanism for discovering what's out there, and then a mechanism for conveying information back to make decisions. But we're not chartered to decide what those decisions will be, how they will use that information, or anything like that.
So dare I say, Glenn, the onus is on others that may have an interest in that sort of thing to ensure that the user requirements document does indeed capture their take on the requirements, but without getting into policy specifications, which are, as you say, out of scope for the charter.
And as they say, comment early and comment often.
As opposed to voting early and often, which somebody famously said fairly recently. But anyway, that's a whole different discussion. Brilliant. Okay, was anyone else want to come in on anything on the user requirements and the ADD working group, which I hadn't envisaged we'd spend as long on, but I think that was a productive discussion. If there's anything else? Take that as a no. The one other thing I was simply going to highlight for those of you that don't follow the TLS mailing list closely, I've been keeping an eye on it because of the relevance ECH, Encrypted Client Hello, which is covered within the TLS mailing list. And I've been amused of the last week or so, a couple of weeks, that there've been a series of what to me look like quite thoughtful contributions from one of the guys from ARM suggesting that TLS 1.3 doesn't really work. He doesn't quite say it in those terms. He highlights a whole series of issues, but he's asked to undeprecate, I think, or something like that, TLS 1.2, because he thinks there are some quite significant issues in TLS 1.3, which will have a knock-on impact on ECH, which requires TLS 1.3 to be functional. So I thought I'd just highlight that to you. If anyone has an interest in that, either refer to the TLS mailing list, or by all means drop me an email if you want a pointer to some of the relevant emails if you've not had a chance to catch up on those. Jim, did you want to come in on that, or did you have something else to raise under AOB in our last 5 minutes?
No, I didn't want to raise anything else, Andrew. It was actually in relation to that point. There was a fairly sharp comment from Rich Saltz about this very issue. So Rich, as you know, is a long-time IETF, a grey beard. He's behind OpenSSL, a whole bunch of other things, and very active in the development of TLS 1.3. And he said, I'm just reading out from his email, I suggest you make sure you understand the analysis approval that have been done. You are very far in the minority here. Even some folks who say we don't need these features, but nobody else has said this is not secure. So this guy, Michael Derrico, has had a fairly firm slap down. I get the sense that this guy has come into the discussion very late and is perhaps criticising TLS 1.3 because of the fact it's got certain features that maybe are not suitable for some things he would like to see. For example, the emphasis on perfect form of security and the difficulty for anybody else to actually intercept or decrypt TLS 1.2 TLS traffic that TLS 1.3 is securing. So I'm not sure that discussion is going to get anywhere, and if this guy is going to get any kind of purchase in the TLS working group. We've kind of been through all that argument several years ago when there was all this argument that was going on over this very issue. And at that point, the losing side, if you can put it that way, decided to go and take the work elsewhere because it wasn't going to get done in the TLS working group. And it may well be we're going to see a repeat of that. Yeah,
possibly, yeah. Well, it'll be interesting because he has been persistent over the last couple of weeks, but let's see.
So did the guys before from US Bank and Blue Cross Health.
Yes.
They persisted for a long time, and eventually, when they realised it wasn't going to happen, they went elsewhere.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, thanks for that, Jim. That's a helpful additional insight. Right, we're in the last couple of minutes, so does anyone want to come in with any last points or final bits of business to raise? I see no virtual hands raised. I can't hear any voices being raised, so I think that is us. So thank you all. That was an interesting and wide-ranging discussion. I hope you found that useful. Have a great week, and we'll speak again in a week's time. Thanks, everyone. Speak to you soon.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.